She was the billionaire's new secretary, but her trembling voice made him want more than work. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. The elevator's polished steel doors reflected Zahara Williams's nervous expression as she adjusted her blazer for the third time that morning. 42 floors above the bustling streets of Chicago, she was about to step into a world she'd only read about in business magazines, the executive floor of Whitmore Industries, where decisions worth millions were made before most people finished their morning coffee. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked toward the reception desk, clutching a leather portfolio that contained her life's work, references, certifications, and a dream that had carried her from the narrow streets of Baltimore to this glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled warmly. "You must be Zahara. I'm Dorothy. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you in conference room C." Zahara's throat tightened. She'd heard stories about Ethan Whitmore, the billionaire who'd built an empire before turning 40, the man whose mere presence could silence a boardroom full of executives. They said he was brilliant, demanding, and completely untouchable. They also said he'd never kept a personal assistant longer than 6 months. Conference Room C was a cathedral of glass and steel, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city below look like a carefully arranged miniature. Zahara placed her portfolio on the mahogany table and tried to steady her breathing. She'd practiced this moment dozens of times, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of being here. The door opened with barely a whisper. Ethan Whitmore entered the room like he owned not just the building, but the very air inside it. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Zahara's monthly rent, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never had to raise his voice to command attention. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his green eyes, sharp as winter frost, seemed to catalogue every detail of her presence in seconds. "Ms. Williams." His voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of authority without being harsh. "Please, sit." Zahara lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She'd read that he preferred directness, that small talk was a waste of his time, but as she opened her mouth to speak, her carefully rehearsed introduction evaporated. She began, then stopped. Her voice had come out smaller than intended, barely above a whisper. Heat rose to her cheeks. "I apologize, Mr. Whitmore. I'm honored to be considered for this position." For the first time since entering the room, Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or surprise. Most people who sat across from him either trembled with obvious fear or overcompensated with false bravado. Zahara was doing neither. Her nervousness was genuine, but there was dignity in it, a quiet strength that refused to be diminished. "Tell me about yourself," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair. Zahara straightened her shoulders and found her voice. She spoke about her education, her previous experience as an executive assistant at a law firm in Baltimore, her decision to move to Chicago for a fresh start. Her words were measured, professional, but there was something in the cadence of her speech, a musicality that made even mundane details sound significant. Ethan found himself listening not just to what she was saying, but how she was saying it. There was no artifice in her tone, no attempt to impress him with corporate jargon or manufactured enthusiasm. When she mentioned leaving Baltimore, a shadow crossed her face for just a moment, so brief that most people would have missed it. But Ethan caught it, and he wondered what she was running from. "The position requires complete discretion," he said. "You'll have access to confidential information that could impact market prices, influence business decisions worth hundreds of millions. You'll know my schedule better than I do, handle correspondence that most of my executives never see. Can you handle that level of responsibility?" "Yes, sir," Zahara replied without hesitation. "I understand the gravity of the role, and I don't take trust lightly." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering logistics, expectations, and protocols. Ethan asked pointed questions about her availability, her willingness to work long hours, her ability to handle pressure. Zahara answered each one with the same quiet competence that had marked her entrance. As they concluded, Ethan stood and extended his hand. "Dorothy will provide you with the necessary paperwork. You start Monday." Zahara blinked, momentarily stunned. You're offering me the position?" "I am." His handshake was firm, brief. "Welcome to Whitmore Industries, Ms. Williams." As she gathered her portfolio and prepared to leave, Zahara turned back. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for this opportunity. I won't disappoint you." Ethan watched her go, noting the way she moved, purposeful but graceful, confident, despite her earlier nervousness. As the door closed behind her, he remained standing by the window, looking out at the city sprawling beneath him. He'd hired hundreds of employees over the years, conducted thousands of interviews. Most blended together in his memory, faces and voices that served their purpose and faded into the background of his carefully ordered world. But something about Zahara Williams lingered. Maybe it was the way her voice had trembled at the beginning, then found its strength. Maybe it was the shadow that had crossed her face when she mentioned Baltimore. Or maybe it was something he couldn't quite name, a sense that this unassuming woman with the gentle voice and steady gaze might be more than she appeared. As he returned to his desk, Ethan pushed the thought aside. He had a company to run, deals to close, profits to maximize. Personal observations had no place in his daily calculations, but later that evening, as he reviewed the day's events in his penthouse office, he found himself wondering what had brought Zahara Williams to Chicago and what secrets lay hidden behind those careful, measured words. What would you risk for a chance at a completely new life? Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Chicago feel alive. Zahara stood outside the Whitmore Industries building at 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes before her scheduled start time, watching the early commuters stream past her like schools of fish navigating an urban reef. Her reflection in the building's glass facade showed a woman who looked far more composed than she felt. The security guard, a middle-aged man with kind eyes named Frank, handed her a temporary badge. "First day jitters?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Is it that obvious?" Zahara replied, grateful for the friendly face. "You'll do fine. Mr. Whitmore doesn't hire people who can't handle the pressure." The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt longer than it had on Friday. When the doors opened, Zahara stepped into a world that was already in motion. The executive floor hummed with quiet efficiency, assistants preparing for morning meetings, the soft murmur of conference calls beginning, the distant sound of keyboards clicking like rainfall. Dorothy greeted her with a warm smile and a steaming cup of coffee. "Colombian blend, 1 sugar. You mentioned it during your interview." Zahara was touched by the attention to detail. "Thank you. I wasn't sure anyone would remember that." "Around here, details matter," Dorothy said, leading her down a hallway lined with abstract paintings and contemporary sculptures. "Your office is right next to Mr. Whitmore's. He likes his assistant close by. Not for conversation, mind you, but for efficiency." The office was smaller than Zahara had expected, but perfectly appointed. A sleek desk faced a window with a partial view of the lake, and everything from the computer to the filing cabinets looked like it had been chosen by someone who understood both form and function. On her desk was a leather-bound planner, already filled with Ethan's schedule for the week. "He has a board meeting at 9, Dorothy explained, followed by calls with Tokyo and London. Lunches with Senator Morrison at the Union Club. You'll need to confirm the reservation. The afternoon is blocked for the Pemberton acquisition review." Zahara studied the schedule, noting the tight timing and overlapping commitments. "What happens if meetings run long?" "They don't," Dorothy said simply. "Mr. Whitmore operates on what we call surgical precision. He says what needs to be said, hears what needs to be heard, and moves on. You'll learn to anticipate his needs before he voices them." As Dorothy left her to settle in, Zahara began organizing her workspace. She was arranging files when she heard the elevator chime down the hall, followed by the sound of purposeful footsteps. Even without seeing him, she knew Ethan had arrived. His office door closed with a soft click, and for the next hour, Zahara familiarized herself with the computer systems, contact databases, and communication protocols. Everything was meticulously organized, labeled with a clarity that spoke to Ethan's preference for order over chaos. At exactly 8:45, her phone buzzed with an internal call. "Ms. Williams, please bring the Pemberton files to conference room A. The board will want to review the projections." "Right away, Mr. Whitmore." Zahara gathered the thick folder from the filing cabinet and made her way to the conference room. She'd expected to simply drop off the documents, but Ethan gestured to an empty chair along the wall. "Stay. You'll need to take notes on any questions that require follow-up." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in corporate strategy. Zahara watched Ethan orchestrate the meeting with the skill of a conductor leading a symphony. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions that revealed gaps in logic or preparation, and made decisions with a swiftness that was both impressive and slightly intimidating. But what struck her most was how he interacted with people. There was no cruelty in his directness, no ego in his authority. He was demanding, yes, but fairly so. When the CFO stumbled over quarterly projections, Ethan didn't embarrass him. He simply asked clarifying questions until the correct numbers emerged. During a brief recess, while board members stepped out for coffee, Ethan noticed Zahara reviewing her notes. "What did you think of Henderson's presentation?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Excuse me, the marketing projections." Henderson seemed uncertain about the Q4 assumptions. Zahara glanced at her notes, then back at Ethan. He referenced 3 different demographic studies, but didn't explain why the results varied so significantly. It seemed like he was hoping no one would notice the inconsistencies. Ethan's eyebrows raised slightly. "You caught that." "I worked with attorneys for 3 years, Zahara said. "They taught me to listen for what people don't say as much as what they do." For a moment, something shifted in Ethan's expression, surprise perhaps, or recalculation. Most assistants in his experience were skilled at organization and communication, but analytical thinking was rarer. He filed the observation away as the board members returned. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of calls, document reviews, and scheduling adjustments. Zahara found herself anticipating Ethan's needs with surprising accuracy, having his coffee ready before he asked, pulling up contact information before he requested it, screening calls with an instinct for which were urgent and which could wait. During lunch, while Ethan was at the Union Club, Zahara ate a sandwich at her desk and used the quiet time to study his calendar for the rest of the week. She noticed patterns, how he scheduled high-stakes meetings in the morning when his energy was sharpest, how he blocked time for strategic thinking between operational calls, how he never scheduled anything after 7 p.m. on Fridays. "Working through lunch already?" Dorothy appeared with a knowing smile. "That's either dedication or a dangerous precedent." "Just trying to get ahead of the learning curve," Zahara replied. "Word of advice? Mr. Whitmore respects competence, but he also respects boundaries. Don't burn yourself out trying to prove yourself in the first week." As the afternoon wore on, Zahara settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. When Ethan's 3 p.m. call with London ran long, she quietly rescheduled his 4 p.m. without being asked. When he needed demographic data for the Pemberton Review, she had it ready before he finished asking. At 6:30, as the office began to empty, Ethan emerged from his office carrying his briefcase. He paused at Zahara's desk, where she was finishing the day's correspondence. "How was your first day, Ms. Williams?" "Challenging in the best possible way," she answered honestly. "Thank you for including me in the board meeting. It helped me understand how everything fits together." Ethan studied her for a moment. "Your observation about Henderson's presentation was accurate. I'll be asking him for clarification tomorrow." As he headed toward the elevator, Zahara called after him, "Mr. Whitmore, have a good evening." He turned back, and for just a second, his professional mask slipped enough to reveal something that might have been surprise, as if no one had wished him a good evening in so long that he'd forgotten what it sounded like. "You as well, Ms. Williams." As the elevator doors closed behind him, Zahara realized she was smiling. The day had been everything she'd hoped for, and nothing like she'd expected. Working for Ethan Whitmore wouldn't be easy, but it might be exactly what she needed. What she didn't know was that 40 floors below, as Ethan walked toward his car, he found himself thinking about the way she'd said, "Have a good evening," not with the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to impress him, but with genuine warmth. It had been a very long time since anyone had spoken to him that way. 3 weeks into her position at Whitmore Industries, Zahara had developed a routine that felt like a carefully choreographed dance. She arrived each morning at 7:30, 30 minutes before Ethan, and used that time to review overnight emails, prepare his coffee, black, no sugar, and organize the day's priorities. By the time his elevator chimed at 8 she had transformed potential chaos into ordered efficiency. This particular Thursday morning carried the weight of something significant. The Pemberton acquisition, worth nearly $2 billion, would be decided in a presentation to the board at 10 a.m. Zahara had spent the previous evening at the office, triple-checking slides, verifying financial projections, and ensuring every detail was perfect. She was adjusting the conference room setup when Ethan arrived, earlier than usual. His tie was slightly askew, a detail so minor that most people wouldn't notice, but Zahara had learned to read the subtle signs of his stress. "The presentation materials are loaded and tested," she said without preamble. "I've also prepared backup files on 3 different systems, just in case." Ethan paused in the doorway, coffee cup halfway to his lips. 3 different systems? "Technology fails at the worst possible moments," Zahara replied, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the conference table's surface. "Murphy's Law seems particularly fond of high-stakes presentations." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Ethan's features. "You've been thinking ahead. It's what you pay me for." But as she spoke, Zahara caught something in his expression, a tension that went deeper than pre-presentation nerves. She'd observed him for weeks now, had learned to distinguish between his various moods like a meteorologist reading weather patterns. This was different, personal. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitmore?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, crossing the invisible line between professional concern and personal interest. Ethan's eyes sharpened, and for a moment, Zahara thought she'd overstepped. "I'm fine, Ms. Williams. Thank you for your concern." The words were polite but distant, a gentle reminder of boundaries. Zahara nodded and returned to her preparations, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was weighing on him. An hour later, board members began arriving for the presentation. Zahara recognized most of them now: Senator Morrison with his politician's smile and expensive watch, Margaret Powell, whose real estate empire rivaled Ethan's business holdings, and James Fletcher, whose family had owned railroad fortunes for 3 generations. They greeted each other with the careful warmth of people who respected each other's power, but trusted no one completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began as the room settled, "today we decide whether Whitmore Industries expands into European markets through the Pemberton acquisition, or whether we pursue organic growth over the next decade." What followed was 90 minutes of financial analysis, risk assessment, and strategic planning that reminded Zahara why Ethan commanded such respect in business circles. He presented not just with expertise, but with a vision that made complex market dynamics seem inevitable, rather than uncertain. But 20 minutes into his presentation, something unexpected happened. As Ethan reached for his water glass, his hand trembled, barely perceptible, but Zahara caught it. Then, as he began reading a key financial projection, his voice hitched almost imperceptibly on the word projected. The room was filled with seasoned executives who lived and breathed presentations, but none of them seemed to notice. Zahara, however, had spent weeks listening to Ethan speak with unwavering confidence. This was different. During a brief recess, while board members discussed the proposal in small groups, Zahara approached Ethan near the window. "The remote clicker is malfunctioning slightly," she said quietly, though the clicker was working perfectly. "Would you like me to replace it?" Ethan looked at her, understanding immediately that she was offering him a moment to collect himself without acknowledging anything was wrong. "Yes, thank you. That would be helpful." As she handed him a backup clicker, which was identical to the first, their fingers brushed briefly. The contact lasted less than a second, but something passed between them. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that they saw each other more clearly than either was entirely comfortable with. "Mr. Whitmore," Zahara said softly, "whatever's troubling you, it doesn't define your strength." The words were out before she could reconsider them. Too personal, too presumptuous. But Ethan didn't pull away or remind her of professional boundaries. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "How do you—" he began, then stopped. "Never mind. How do I what? How do you always know the right thing to say?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Zahara felt the weight of it, the implications of answering honestly. "Because I recognize the look of someone carrying something heavy," she said finally. "It takes one to know one." Before Ethan could respond, Senator Morrison called the meeting back to order. But as they returned to their seats, something fundamental had shifted. The professional distance that had defined their relationship for weeks had developed the first small crack. The presentation concluded with unanimous board approval for the acquisition. As members filed out, congratulating Ethan on the strategic vision and flawless execution, Zahara remained behind to gather materials and shut down the presentation equipment. "Ms. Williams," Ethan said when they were alone, "what you said earlier was completely inappropriate, and I apologize." Zahara interrupted quickly. "I overstepped and it won't happen again." "No," Ethan said firmly. "It wasn't inappropriate. It was unexpected." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough to notice that his expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the scent that was uniquely him. "You're not what I expected when I hired you," he continued. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure yet." The honesty in his answer surprised them both. For weeks, they'd maintained perfect professional decorum, but now they were standing in territory neither had mapped. "Zahara," he said, using her first name for the first time since her interview, "have dinner with me tonight." The request, not quite a command, not quite a question, hung in the air between them. Zahara felt her carefully constructed boundaries wavering. "Mr. Whitmore—" "Ethan," he corrected softly. "And before you say it's inappropriate, this isn't about work. This is about two people who seem to understand each other in ways that have nothing to do with business." Zahara looked into his eyes and saw vulnerability that she suspected few people were ever allowed to witness. The powerful billionaire who commanded boardrooms and influenced markets was asking her, not demanding, asking, for something as simple as dinner conversation. "One dinner," she said quietly, "as long as we're clear about what this is." "And what is it?" "I'm not sure yet," she echoed his earlier words. As they left the conference room together, Zahara couldn't help but wonder if she was making the wisest decision of her life or the most dangerous mistake. But for the first time since arriving in Chicago, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the most dangerous conversations are the ones that feel most natural. Zahara spent the remainder of Thursday afternoon second-guessing her decision. Every time her phone buzzed with a work-related message, she wondered if Ethan was reconsidering his invitation. By 6 p.m., as the office began its nightly exodus, her stomach was performing acrobatics that had nothing to do with hunger. She was gathering her belongings when Ethan appeared at her desk, and she was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the armor of his business suit, replaced by dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made him seem younger, more approachable, more human. "Ready?" he asked, and she noticed he seemed as uncertain as she felt. "Where are we going?" Zahara asked as they walked toward the elevator. "Somewhere we won't run into anyone from the office," Ethan replied. "I know a place." The place turned out to be a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, the kind of establishment that survived on the loyalty of neighborhood regulars rather than tourist dollars. Red-checkered tablecloths, wine bottles converted to candle holders, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that couldn't be manufactured by corporate designers. "This is," Zahara began as they were seated at a corner table. "Not what you expected," Ethan finished. "I was going to say perfect, actually." The admission surprised them both. Zahara had expected some exclusive establishment where billionaires conducted discreet meetings. Instead, she found herself in a place that felt warm, unpretentious, and oddly intimate. Their server, an elderly woman named Rosa, who clearly knew Ethan, brought them menus and a basket of bread without being asked. "The usual wine, Mr. E. Actually, let's see what the lady prefers," Ethan said, glancing at Zahara. "Rosa makes the best red sauce in Chicago, by the way. This place has been here since 1952. How did you find it?" Zahara asked, accepting a glass of Chianti that Rosa had poured without waiting for her order. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 12, Ethan said, a shadow of memory crossing his face. He said the best business lessons weren't learned in boardrooms, but in places where real people lived their lives. It was the first personal detail he'd ever shared with her, and Zahara found herself hungry for more. Was he in business too? Construction. Built half the apartment buildings in Queens before moving the company to Chicago. Ethan broke off a piece of bread, his movements automatic. "He died when I was 16, left me everything, including advice I didn't understand until much later." "What kind of advice?" Ethan looked at her across the candle-lit table, as if weighing how much truth he was willing to share. "He said that success was meaningless if you had no one to share it with, that building an empire was easy compared to building a life." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Zahara took a sip of wine, using the time to formulate a response that wouldn't shatter whatever fragile intimacy was developing. "Did you take his advice?" she asked finally. "I tried to," Ethan said quietly. "Marriage at 28 to someone I thought understood the world I lived in. But it turns out sharing wealth isn't the same as sharing a life." "What happened?" "She wanted the lifestyle that came with being Mrs. Ethan Whitmore. I wanted someone who could see past it." He met Zahara's eyes. "Turns out we both got exactly what we asked for." Zahara felt the pain beneath his words, the carefully controlled bitterness of someone who'd learned that love could be transactional. "I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me something valuable about the difference between being wanted and being seen. They ordered dinner, Rosa's famous lasagna for him, chicken parmesan for her, and as they waited for the food, the conversation shifted to safer territory. Zahara talked about growing up in Baltimore, her parents who'd worked double shifts to put her through college, her decision to study business administration because it seemed practical. "What did you really want to study?" Ethan asked. The question caught her off guard. "How do you know I didn't choose business?" "Because when you talk about your work, you're competent and professional. When you talked about your parents, your voice changed completely. There's something else you're passionate about." Zahara stared at him, unnerved by his perceptiveness. "Literature," she admitted. "I wanted to teach high school English, help kids fall in love with stories the way I did." "What changed your mind?" "Reality," she said simply. "Teachers don't make enough money to pay off student loans and help their parents with medical bills." Ethan nodded slowly. "So you chose security over passion." "I chose responsibility over dreams," Zahara corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Before she could answer, Rosa arrived with their dinner and the conversation turned to lighter topics. Favorite books, places they'd traveled, childhood memories that made them laugh. Zahara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since arriving in Chicago, perhaps since leaving Baltimore. It wasn't until they were sharing tiramisu that Ethan asked the question she'd been dreading. "What brought you to Chicago, really? I know the official story about new opportunities, but that's not everything." Zahara set down her fork, the dessert suddenly tasteless. She'd known this moment would come, had practiced various versions of the truth that revealed nothing important. But looking at Ethan across the table, seeing the way he'd opened himself to her, she found herself unable to lie. "I was engaged," she said quietly, "to someone I'd known since college. Safe, predictable, everything my parents wanted for me. What happened? I realized I was about to marry someone I respected but didn't love, someone who saw me as a convenient accessory to the life he'd planned." She met Ethan's eyes. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called it off, gave back the ring, and used the money I'd saved for the honeymoon to move here instead. That must have taken incredible courage. It felt more like cowardice at the time, running away instead of figuring out how to be happy where I was. "Sometimes running away is the bravest thing you can do," Ethan said softly. "Sometimes it's the only way to find out who you really are." The words created a moment of connection so intense that Zahara felt breathless. Here was this powerful, successful man who understood exactly what it felt like to choose the unknown over the comfortable, to risk everything for the possibility of something real. "We should probably head back," she said, suddenly aware of how late it had gotten, how intimate the conversation had become. "Probably," Ethan agreed, but neither of them moved to leave. Instead, they sat in the warm glow of Rosa's restaurant, two people who'd spent years building walls around their hearts, slowly beginning to recognize that some barriers were meant to be crossed. As they finally walked to Ethan's car, Zahara realized she felt more like herself than she had in months. Not the careful professional assistant she'd become, not the dutiful daughter she'd always been, but some truer version of herself that only seemed to emerge in his presence. And that terrified her more than anything else about this dangerous, beautiful evening. Friday morning arrived with the kind of grey October sky that matched Zahara's mood perfectly, uncertain, heavy with possibility, and threatening to change at any moment. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying mascara with hands that weren't quite steady, replaying every moment of the previous evening. The drive back to her apartment had been quiet, filled with a tension that wasn't uncomfortable but felt significant. When Ethan walked her to her door, a gesture so old-fashioned it caught her off guard, he'd paused on her doorstep. "Thank you for dinner," she'd said, fishing for her keys to avoid looking directly at him. "Zahara." The way he said her name made her look up. "I meant what I said about seeing past things. You do that." Before she could respond, he'd leaned down and kissed her cheek, so softly she might have imagined it. Then he was gone, leaving her standing in her doorway with her heart racing and her carefully constructed professional boundaries in ruins. Now, 12 hours later, she was trying to figure out how to face him at work. How do you look at someone across a conference table when you've seen the vulnerability beneath their power? How do you maintain professional distance when they've trusted you with their secrets? The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt interminable. Zahara had arrived early, hoping to settle into her routine before Ethan arrived, but as the doors opened, she saw light coming from his office. He was already there. She made his coffee, black, no sugar, and knocked softly on his door. "Come in." Ethan was standing by his window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loosened. He looked like he hadn't slept, and Zahara felt a pang of concern that had nothing to do with professional obligation. "You're here early," she said, setting his coffee on the desk. "I never left." He turned to face her, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep, so I came in around midnight to work on the Morrison contract." "Ethan!" The name slipped out before she could stop it, before she remembered they were back in the office where boundaries mattered. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Last night it was real. That doesn't have to change just because we're here." But even as he said it, Zahara could feel the weight of their environment pressing down on them. The gleaming office, the corporate hierarchy, the dozens of employees who depended on both of them to maintain professional standards, it all seemed designed to make last night feel like a beautiful mistake. "We should probably talk about this," she said. "Probably." Ethan moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the scent of exhaustion. "But not here. Not now." Before either could say more, Dorothy's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Whitmore? The Jakarta team is holding on line 1 for the quarterly review." The spell broken, they slipped back into their professional roles with practiced ease. Ethan straightened his tie, Zahara gathered her notepad, and for the next 3 hours, they were simply employer and employee navigating the complex choreography of international business. But beneath the surface, something had fundamentally changed. Zahara found herself noticing things she'd trained herself to ignore. The way Ethan's jaw tightened when he was concentrating, how he absently tapped his pen during conference calls, the rare moments when his business mask slipped to reveal the man she'd had dinner with. Around noon, Margaret Powell arrived for a lunch meeting about a joint venture in commercial real estate. Zahara had met her briefly during board meetings, but this was her first time observing the older woman up close. Margaret was everything Zahara imagined when she thought of powerful women, impeccably dressed, sharp-eyed, with the kind of confidence that came from decades of success in a male-dominated industry. "Zahara, isn't it?" Margaret said, as Zahara led her to the conference room. "I've heard good things about your work here." "Thank you, Ms. Powell. That's very kind." "It's not kindness, it's observation. Ethan's had challenges with assistants in the past. Too many of them seemed more interested in the man than the job." The comment was delivered with surgical precision, and Zahara felt heat rise to her cheeks. Did her feelings show so obviously? Was Margaret warning her, or simply making conversation? "I'm here to work, Miss Powell, nothing more." Margaret studied her for a moment, then smiled, an expression that was both warm and calculating. "Good. Because that man has been alone for far too long, and he deserves someone who sees him for who he really is, not what he owns." Before Zahara could process the implications of that statement, Ethan arrived for the meeting, and Margaret seamlessly shifted into business mode. But as Zahara took notes during their discussion of property acquisitions and market trends, she found herself thinking about Margaret's words. The afternoon brought a crisis that demanded all of Zahara's professional skills. A supplier in Thailand had defaulted on a major contract, threatening to delay the opening of 3 new Whitmore properties in Southeast Asia. Phone calls flew between Chicago, Bangkok, and Singapore as Ethan worked to salvage deals worth hundreds of millions. Zahara found herself anticipating his needs with uncanny accuracy, having contact information ready before he asked, preparing briefing documents on alternative suppliers, coordinating conference calls across multiple time zones. They worked together with a synchronicity that surprised them both, professional partners who understood each other's rhythms instinctively. It wasn't until 8 p.m., when the crisis had been resolved and the office had emptied, that they found themselves alone again. Ethan emerged from his office looking drained but satisfied, loosening his tie as he approached Zahara's desk. "You were remarkable today," he said. "The way you handled the Thailand situation, you probably saved us months of delays." "We handled it," Zahara corrected. "I just kept the pieces moving while you found the solutions." "Is that how you see yourself? As someone who just keeps the pieces moving?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "You have instincts, Zahara. Business instincts that most people spend years developing. When you suggested calling Harrison Industries as a backup supplier, that wasn't just administrative work, that was strategy." Zahara felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with personal attraction. For years, she'd seen herself as support staff, as someone who facilitated other people's success. The idea that she might have strategic value, that her contributions went beyond organization and efficiency, was intoxicating. I should go, she said, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how the office felt different after hours, more intimate, full of possibilities that daylight kept at bay. Zahara. Ethan's voice stopped her at the elevator. Tomorrow's Saturday, no meetings, no crises. Would you like to see Chicago? The real Chicago, not just the view from the 42nd floor? She should say no. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she was walking into territory that could destroy everything she'd worked for. But as she looked at him, rumpled, exhausted, more human than billionaire, she found herself nodding. I'd like that. As the elevator doors closed between them, Zahara realized she was no longer just crossing professional boundaries. She was leaping over them entirely, with no clear idea where she might land. But for the first time in her life, the uncertainty felt like freedom instead of fear. Sometimes the most dangerous territory is the space between what we want and what we think we should have. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made Chicago feel like a postcard. Zahara stood at her apartment window, watching joggers navigate the sidewalks below, while she debated for the third time whether she was making a terrible mistake. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Meet me at Millennium Park, Crown Fountain, 10 a.m. Dress for walking. She chose jeans, comfortable boots, and a burgundy sweater that brought out the warmth in her dark skin. An outfit that felt like herself, rather than the polished professional version she wore to work. As she walked toward the park, she wondered what version of Ethan she'd encounter today. She found him standing near the fountain and her breath caught. Gone was every trace of the corporate executive. He wore dark jeans, hiking boots, and a navy jacket that made his eyes look more blue than green. He was holding 2 coffee cups and watching children run through the fountain's shallow pools, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You look, he began as she approached, then seemed to lose his words. Different, she suggested. Beautiful, he said simply, handing her one of the coffee cups. I got you a vanilla latte. Seemed like your Saturday morning drink. The fact that he'd guessed correctly, and that he'd been thinking about what she might like, sent warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. So, Zahara said, what does the real Chicago tour include? Everything the guidebooks don't mention, Ethan replied, starting with breakfast at Lou's Diner, where my grandfather used to take me on Saturdays. Lou's Diner turned out to be a cramped, noisy establishment, where the waitresses called everyone Hon, and the coffee came in chipped mugs that had probably been there since the 1970s. They squeezed into a booth with red vinyl seats that had been patched with duct tape, and Zahara found herself charmed by the complete absence of pretense. 2 regulars, Ethan told the waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and tired feet. Haven't seen you in months, Ethan, she scolded gently. You work too much. I know, Dolores. I'm trying to do better. As they waited for their food, Ethan told her about Saturday mornings with his grandfather, how they'd come here after visiting construction sites, how his grandfather would quiz him about business over pancakes and bacon, how this place had taught him that wealth meant nothing if you forgot where you came from. He sounds like he was an incredible man, Zahara said. He was the only person who ever called me on my nonsense, Ethan replied. When I got too full of myself in high school, he'd bring me here and make me bus tables for Dolores. Said it would remind me that success was about serving others, not being served. Their breakfast arrived. Pancakes the size of dinner plates, bacon that actually sizzled, eggs cooked exactly right. As they ate, Zahara found herself studying Ethan's face, noting how relaxed he looked, how different his laugh sounded when it wasn't measured and controlled. Your turn, he said. Tell me about your Saturdays growing up. Saturday mornings were for my mother's famous cinnamon rolls, Zahara said. She'd start the dough at 5 a.m., and by the time my brother and I woke up, the whole house smelled like heaven. We'd eat them while watching cartoons, and she'd tell us stories about her grandmother, who came north from South Carolina with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. What was her dream? That her family would have choices she never had. That we'd go to college, travel, build lives bigger than the neighborhood we grew up in. Zahara paused, suddenly emotional. She died 3 years ago. Cancer. She never got to see me graduate, never saw me get my first real job. Ethan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, comforting, and completely natural. She would be proud of you. I hope so. Some days I wonder if I'm living her dream or just running from mine. What's your dream? The question hung between them, simple and profound. Zahara realized no one had asked her that in years. Not her ex-fiancé, not her friends, not even herself. I used to think I wanted to teach, to help kids fall in love with stories. But lately, She looked at him across the diner table. Lately, I think maybe I want to write stories of my own. What's stopping you? Fear, mostly. Fear of failing. Fear of discovering I'm not as good as I hope. Fear of wanting something so much that losing it would break me. Those are all good reasons to try, Ethan said softly. The things that scare us most are usually the things worth fighting for. After breakfast, they walked through Lincoln Park Zoo, where Ethan confessed to a childhood fascination with penguins, then spent an hour at the conservatory among tropical plants that made the October chill feel like a distant memory. He told her about business trips to exotic locations that he'd never had time to actually see, and she told him about books that had taken her to places she'd never been. Around noon, they found themselves at North Avenue Beach, walking along the lakefront as joggers and cyclists passed them in both directions. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp but invigorating, and Zahara pulled her sweater tighter as they found a bench facing the water. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. When you were married, were you happy?" Ethan was quiet for so long that Zahara wondered if she'd crossed a line. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I thought I was. Miranda was everything I was supposed to want. Beautiful, sophisticated, from the right family. She understood the social obligations, the charity galas, the networking events. She played the role of Mrs. Ethan Whitmore perfectly. But she never asked me what I was afraid of, never wondered what I dreamed about when I couldn't sleep. She loved the idea of me, the lifestyle I could provide, but she never seemed particularly interested in who I actually was." He turned to look at Zahara. "When she left, I realized I was more relieved than heartbroken. That's when I knew I'd been living someone else's life. Is that why you don't date anymore?" "I date," Ethan said with a rueful smile. "Carefully vetted women who understand that dinner doesn't mean forever. Safe, superficial connections that don't threaten the walls I've built. And then you walked into my office with a trembling voice and steady eyes, and I realized my walls might not be as solid as I thought." The admission hung between them like a confession. Zahara felt her heart racing as she processed the implications of his words. "Ethan." "I know," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea. But for the first time in years, I'm more interested in the reasons why it might be wonderful." Before she could respond, he stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, there's one more place I want to show you." They took the L train to a neighborhood Zahara had never explored, getting off at a stop that led them through tree-lined streets, full of brownstones and small cafes. Ethan led her to a used bookstore called Chapter and Verse, where the owners seemed to know him by name, and the shelves reached from floor to ceiling. "I come here when I need to remember that there are worlds beyond quarterly reports," he explained as they wandered through the narrow aisles. "What's your favorite book?" "That's like asking me to pick a favorite star," Zahara protested. "Try." She pulled a worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God from the literature section. "This one changed my life when I was 16, made me understand that words could be powerful, that stories could heal." Ethan studied the book, then her face. "Read me something. Here. Now. Please." Zahara opened to a passage she'd memorized years ago and began to read, her voice soft but clear. As she spoke, Zora Neale Hurston's words about love and independence and finding yourself, she became aware that Ethan wasn't looking at the book. He was watching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and cherished at the same time. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. "That's what I heard that first day," he said quietly, "in the conference room, when your voice trembled. There was something underneath the nervousness. Depth, soul, stories waiting to be told." As they left the bookstore, Zahara realized that somewhere between breakfast and literature, between personal confessions and shared laughter, she'd fallen not just for the powerful billionaire, but for the man who remembered his grandfather's lessons and could spend hours in a used bookstore without checking his phone once. And that realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The following Monday arrived with an unexpected complication. Zahara was reviewing Ethan's calendar when she noticed a new appointment that made her stomach drop. 2 p.m. Coffee with Miranda Whitmore Sterling. She stared at the entry, trying to process why Ethan's ex-wife would suddenly reappear in his schedule. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, and in all her time working for him, Miranda had never called, never visited, never been mentioned except in passing. "Ms. Williams?" Ethan's voice came through the intercom. "Could you come in for a moment?" Zahara knocked and entered his office, where she found him standing by the window, his posture tense in a way she'd learned to recognize as trouble. "I see you've noticed the addition to my calendar," he said without turning around. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to confirm the meeting or if there were special arrangements needed," Zahara replied, keeping her voice professionally neutral despite the knot forming in her chest. "She called this morning, said she had something important to discuss." Ethan finally turned to face her. "I almost said no. What changed your mind?" "Curiosity, I suppose. Miranda doesn't do anything without a reason, and she certainly doesn't seek out my company unless she wants something." Zahara nodded, though every instinct told her this meeting was a threat to the fragile connection she and Ethan had been building. "Would you like me to arrange for the meeting to be held somewhere private? The conference room will be fine." "And Zahara?" He moved closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone she'd come to treasure. "This doesn't change anything between us." But even as he said it, Zahara could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Miranda's reappearance was already changing things, creating ripples in the careful balance they'd established. At exactly 2 p.m. the elevator chimed, and Zahara looked up to see a woman who could have stepped out of a fashion magazine. Miranda Whitmore Sterling was tall, blonde, and possessed the kind of effortless elegance that came from a lifetime of privilege. Her designer coat probably cost more than Zahara made in a month, and she moved through the office like she still belonged there. "Hello," Miranda said, approaching Zahara's desk with a smile that was perfectly polite and completely cold. "You must be the new assistant. I'm Miranda." "Ms. Williams," Zahara replied, standing to shake her hand. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. Can I offer you coffee or water?" "Nothing, thank you." Miranda's eyes swept over Zahara with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent years evaluating potential competition. "You're quite young, aren't you?" The comment was delivered with such subtle venom that Zahara almost missed the insult. Almost. "I'll let Mr. Whitmore know you're here," she said, maintaining her professional composure. "Actually," Miranda said, settling into the chair across from Zahara's desk, "why don't we chat for a moment first? I'm curious about the woman who's managed to last longer than any of Ethan's previous assistants." Zahara felt like she was being circled by a predator. "I'm simply here to do my job, Ms. Sterling." "Of course you are." Miranda's smile widened. "And you do it very well, I'm sure. Ethan always did appreciate efficiency." There was something in the way she said efficiency that made Zahara's skin crawl. Before she could respond, Ethan's office door opened. "Miranda," his voice was carefully controlled, giving nothing away. "Please, come in." As Miranda glided past her toward Ethan's office, she paused at Zahara's desk. "It was lovely meeting you, dear. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." The door closed behind them, leaving Zahara alone with a growing sense of dread. She tried to focus on her work, but every few minutes she found herself glancing toward Ethan's office, wondering what Miranda wanted, why she'd come back, and what her presence might mean for the fragile relationship that had been developing between her and Ethan. The meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes. When Miranda finally emerged, she looked satisfied in a way that made Zahara's stomach clench. She paused at Zahara's desk again, her smile somehow even more predatory than before. "Take care of yourself, dear," she said. "Chicago can be such a lonely city for newcomers." After Miranda left, Zahara waited for Ethan to call her in, to explain what the meeting had been about. But his office remained silent, the door closed, and as the afternoon wore on, she began to wonder if something fundamental had changed. At 6 p.m., when most of the office had emptied, Ethan finally emerged. He looked exhausted, aged by whatever conversation he'd had with his ex-wife. "Are you all right?" Zahara asked, unable to maintain professional distance in the face of his obvious distress. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's been a long day." "Ethan." She stood, moving around her desk toward him. What did she want? He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt, maybe, or fear. "She knows," he said quietly. "Knows what?" "About us. About the dinners. The time we've been spending together. She made it very clear that she's aware something has changed." Zahara felt ice form in her stomach. How could she possibly know? Miranda has her ways. She always did. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. "She also made it clear what she thinks about it." "And what does she think?" "That I'm making the same mistake I made with her, confusing professional competence with personal connection. That I'm putting you in an impossible position, using my power to pursue someone who can't say no without risking her career." The words hit Zahara like physical blows. Not because they were cruel, but because there was enough truth in them to sting. "Is that what you think?" she asked quietly. "That I'm here because I can't say no?" "No," Ethan said immediately. "But Miranda has a gift for finding the weak spots in any argument. She made me realize how this might look to others, what it could do to your reputation if word got out. Since when do you care what others think?" "Since it started affecting someone I care about." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and raw. Zahara stepped closer, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes. "Ethan, look at me." She waited until he met her gaze. "I'm not here because you're my boss. I'm here because for the first time in my life, I feel like someone sees me, really sees me. Not what I can do for them, not how I fit into their plans, but who I actually am." "But what if she's right? What if I'm being selfish, putting you in a position where you feel you can't say no?" "Then you're underestimating me," Zahara said firmly. "I ran away from a wedding 2 weeks before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. If I can do that, I think I can handle saying no to my boss if that's what I wanted." For a moment, hope flickered in Ethan's eyes. Then it dimmed again. "There's something else," he said. "Miranda didn't just come here to warn me about office gossip. She came to make me an offer." "What kind of offer?" "She's getting remarried. To a senator, actually. And she wants to make sure there are no complications from our past. She's offering to sign a more comprehensive non-disclosure agreement in exchange for consideration." "What kind of consideration?" "The kind that comes with a very large check and the understanding that I'll avoid any romantic entanglements that might reflect poorly on her new husband's family values platform." Zahara stared at him, trying to process the calculated cruelty of the proposition. "She's trying to buy your loneliness." "In a way, yes. And are you considering it?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with everything they'd built and everything they stood to lose. Ethan stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and conflict in his face. "A week ago I might have," he said quietly, "but that was before I remembered what it felt like to want someone to see me come home, before I remembered what it was like to share a conversation that mattered. And now I think Miranda is terrified that I might actually be happy, and she can't stand the thought of me moving on while she's still trying to control the narrative of our failed marriage." Relief flooded through Zahara, but it was tempered by the realization that Miranda's visit had changed something fundamental. The secret space they'd been building was no longer secret, and the outside world was pressing in with all its complications and judgments. "So what do we do?" she asked. Ethan reached up and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "We decide whether what we're building is worth fighting for." As he leaned down and kissed her, soft, tentative, full of question marks, Zahara realized they'd crossed another line. Not just the physical one, but the emotional one that separated wanting something from being willing to fight for it. When they broke apart, both breathless, Zahara knew there was no going back. Sometimes the greatest threat to new love isn't doubt, it's the ghost of old wounds trying to reopen. The next morning brought consequences that neither Zahara nor Ethan had anticipated. She arrived at the office to find Dorothy waiting by her desk, her usually warm expression replaced by something careful and concerned. "Zahara, dear," Dorothy said quietly, "Mr. Harrison from Human Resources would like to see you in his office. Right away." Zahara's blood turned cold. James Harrison was the kind of HR director who handled sensitive situations, harassment claims, ethical violations, terminations that required legal precision. She'd never spoken to him directly, had hoped she never would. Did he say what it was about? "No, but—" Dorothy glanced around, then leaned closer. "There have been some calls this morning, people asking questions about you and Mr. Whitmore." The walk to Harrison's office felt like a death march. Zahara's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Someone had seen them at dinner, had photographed them at the bookstore, had somehow learned about the growing intimacy between them. Harrison's office was sterile and intimidating, all glass and chrome with motivational posters about teamwork and integrity that felt suddenly ominous. He was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible way employees could complicate each other's lives. "Ms. Williams, please sit." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "I'm sure you're wondering why you're here." "I have some idea," Zahara said, deciding that honesty was her only viable strategy. "Do you?" Harrison opened a file on his desk. "Because I received a very interesting call this morning from Miranda Whitmore Sterling. She expressed some concerns about your working relationship with Mr. Whitmore." Zahara felt her throat tighten. "What kind of concerns?" "She suggested that there might be inappropriate conduct occurring between you and your supervisor, specifically that you might be leveraging personal relationships to advance your career, or that Mr. Whitmore might be using his position to pursue a romantic relationship with a subordinate. The words hit Zahara like physical blows, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced something real and meaningful to the worst possible interpretation. And what did you tell her? I told her that Whitmore Industries takes all such allegations seriously and that we would conduct a thorough investigation. Harrison leaned back in his chair. So, Miss Williams, is there anything you'd like to tell me about your relationship with Mr. Whitmore? Zahara stared at him, weighing her options. Lying would be easy, but potentially catastrophic if evidence existed. Telling the truth would confirm Miranda's accusations, but might allow her to control the narrative. Mr. Whitmore and I have developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect, she said carefully. We've had dinner twice to discuss work-related matters. Just work-related matters? We've also discussed personal topics, yes. I believe that understanding your colleagues as people makes for a more effective working relationship. Harrison made notes in the file. Have there been any romantic or physical interactions between you and Mr. Whitmore? The question hung in the air like a trap. Zahara thought about the kiss the night before, about the way Ethan had looked at her, about the growing connection that felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced. We kissed once, she said quietly. Last night after work hours, not on company property. I see. More notes. And who initiated this kiss? Does it matter? It might. If you felt pressured or coerced. I didn't, Zahara interrupted firmly. Mr. Whitmore has never used his position to pressure me into anything. If anything, he's been more concerned about the power imbalance than I have. Harrison studied her for a long moment. Ms. Williams, I'm going to be frank with you. This puts the company in a very difficult position. Even if the relationship is consensual, it creates potential liability issues. There are questions of favoritism, conflicts of interest, hostile work environment claims from other employees. What are you saying? I'm saying that one of you will need to transfer to a different department, or one of you will need to find employment elsewhere. The words hit Zahara like a punch to the stomach. She'd known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it real in a way that terrified her. And if I refuse? Then we'll have to consider termination for violation of company policy regarding workplace relationships. Zahara stared at him, trying to process the impossible choice he was presenting. Give up her job or give up Ethan? Abandon her career or abandon the first relationship that had ever felt like it might be worth fighting for? How long do I have to decide? End of the week, Harrison said, closing the file. And Ms. Williams, I'd recommend that you and Mr. Whitmore maintain strictly professional interactions until this matter is resolved. The walk back to her desk felt surreal. Zahara was vaguely aware of co-workers glancing at her, of whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. Word was already spreading, she realized. Office gossip moved faster than official communications, and her reputation was probably being dissected in break rooms across the building. She was sitting at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen, when Ethan emerged from his office. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. My office, he said quietly. Now. Once the door was closed, he moved toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. Don't, she said. Harrison made it clear that we need to maintain professional distance until this is resolved. Harrison called you in? Ethan's voice was tight with controlled anger. Because of Miranda's call? You knew she was going to do this. I suspected she might try something, but I didn't think she'd move this quickly. Ethan ran his hands through his hair. What did you tell him? The truth, or part of it? Zahara looked at him across the space that suddenly felt like an ocean. He gave me an ultimatum. Transfer departments, find another job, or face termination. That's unacceptable. I won't let them force you out because of our decisions, Zahara corrected. We both knew this was a risk. So what do we do? Zahara was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed to lead to loss. I don't know, but I need to think about this rationally, not emotionally. And what does rational thinking tell you? That I can't afford to lose this job. That I move to Chicago for a fresh start. Not to become the subject of office gossip and HR investigations. That maybe Miranda was right about the impossible position this puts me in. Each word felt like a small betrayal, but Zahara forced herself to say them. Because underneath her growing feelings for Ethan was a practical truth. She needed this job, needed the stability and the opportunities it provided. She couldn't afford to be reckless with her career, no matter how much her heart wanted to fight for something real. "So you're giving up on us," Ethan said quietly. "I'm trying to protect us both. If I transfer to another department, maybe we can—" "You know that won't work. The damage is already done." Miranda made sure of that when she called Harrison. Ethan moved closer, ignoring the professional distance she'd tried to maintain. "She's counting on us to back down, to let fear make our decisions for us. Maybe fear is the right response here. Maybe we're being naive to think this could work." "Look at me," Ethan said, his voice intense. "Look at me and tell me what we have isn't worth fighting for." Zahara met his eyes and saw everything she'd come to treasure: his intelligence, his vulnerability, his surprising gentleness, the way he made her feel seen and valued. But she also saw the impossible complexity of their situation, the forces arrayed against them, the potential cost of choosing love over security. "It doesn't matter what it's worth," she said quietly. "Sometimes loving someone means protecting them from the consequences of that love." Before Ethan could respond, her phone rang with an internal call. She glanced at the display and saw Harrison's extension. "Miss Williams." Harrison's voice was carefully neutral when she answered. "Could you come back to my office? There's been a development." As Zahara hung up, she realized that whatever Miranda had set in motion was far from over. The chess game was just beginning, and she was no longer sure she knew how to play. When love becomes a battlefield, sometimes the cruelest wounds are the ones we inflict on ourselves. Zahara's second trip to Harrison's office that day felt different. His demeanor had shifted from professional concern to something approaching embarrassment, and there was another person in the room, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive briefcase. "Ms. Williams," Harrison said, gesturing to the newcomer, "this is Diane Chen, our external legal counsel. There have been some complications regarding the situation we discussed earlier." Diane stood and extended her hand. "Ms. Williams, I apologize for the unusual circumstances, but we've received some additional information that requires immediate clarification." Zahara shook her hand, her mind racing. "What kind of information?" "It seems that Miranda Whitmore Sterling may have had ulterior motives for her accusations," Diane said, opening her briefcase and removing a thick folder. "We've been contacted by her ex-husband's legal team with some rather illuminating documents." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It appears that Mrs. Sterling has been attempting to manipulate both you and Mr. Whitmore as part of a larger strategy related to her upcoming marriage." Diane opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Senator Morrison, Mrs. Sterling's fiancé, is facing a challenging re-election campaign. His platform heavily emphasizes family values and moral leadership. It seems Mrs. Sterling was concerned that any appearance of Mr. Whitmore moving on romantically might undermine her narrative of being the wronged party in their divorce." "I don't understand," Zahara said, though pieces were beginning to fall into place. "She needed Mr. Whitmore to appear either isolated and bitter or involved in something that could be painted as unseemly," Diane continued. "A relationship with a subordinate would fit perfectly into the latter category." Harrison leaned forward. "Ms. Williams, did Mrs. Sterling say anything to you during her visit that seemed designed to discourage your relationship with Mr. Whitmore?" Zahara thought back to Miranda's perfectly venomous comments, the calculated cruelty disguised as concern. "She made it clear that she thought I was out of my depth, that Chicago could be lonely for newcomers. And you felt threatened?" "I felt like I was being warned off." Diane nodded grimly. "What's particularly troubling is that Mrs. Sterling appears to have hired a private investigator to document your interactions with Mr. Whitmore. Photos were taken at the restaurant where you had dinner, at the bookstore where you spent Saturday afternoon." The violation felt like ice in Zahara's veins. Their private moments, their tentative exploration of genuine connection, had been turned into evidence against them. "But here's where it gets interesting," Diane continued. "The investigator became uncomfortable with the assignment when Mrs. Sterling asked him to fabricate evidence of more intimate contact. When he refused, she threatened to ruin his business. So she made it all up?" "Not all of it. Your relationship with Mr. Whitmore is real, and it does present certain HR challenges, but her motivation for reporting it wasn't concern for workplace ethics. It was political calculation." Harrison cleared his throat. "Ms. Williams, in light of this new information, we're prepared to offer you several options. You can transfer to another department with no change in salary or benefits. You can continue in your current position with the understanding that your relationship with Mr. Whitmore will be monitored for any signs of impropriety. Or, Diane smiled for the first time since Zahara had met her. Mr. Whitmore has made a rather unusual proposal. Before Zahara could ask what that meant, there was a knock on Harrison's door. Ethan entered without waiting for permission, his face tight with controlled fury. "I assume you've explained the situation to Ms. Williams," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We were just getting to your proposal," Harrison replied. Ethan looked directly at Zahara. "I'm resigning my position as CEO of Whitmore Industries." The words hit the room like a bomb. Zahara stared at him, unable to process what she'd just heard. "Ethan, no," she said, standing abruptly. "You can't do that. Not for me." "It's not just for you," he replied calmly. "It's for us. And it's for me. I've spent the last 3 years building walls around my life, letting fear of Miranda's manipulations dictate my choices. I'm tired of living that way." Harrison looked panicked. "Mr. Whitmore, surely we can find another solution." "We can," Ethan said. "I'm promoting myself to chairman of the board and stepping back from day-to-day operations. Marcus Delacroix will take over as CEO. He's been ready for months. I'll maintain ownership and strategic oversight, but I'll no longer be Miss Williams' direct supervisor." Zahara felt the world tilting around her. "You're restructuring your entire company because of us." "I'm restructuring my life because I finally found someone worth restructuring it for," Ethan said simply. "I've spent years building a business empire, but I've been living in an emotional desert. You changed that." Diane closed her folder with a satisfied expression. "Actually, this solution addresses all of our concerns. There would be no direct reporting relationship, no conflict of interest issues, and the transition has been in planning stages for months anyway." "But what about Miranda?" Zahara asked. "What about her threats?" "Miranda's power was based on secrecy and shame," Ethan said. "She counted on us being afraid of what people would think, afraid of standing up to her manipulations. But I'm tired of giving her that power." Harrison looked between them, clearly out of his depth. "So what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that Ms. Williams continue in her current role reporting to the new CEO," Ethan said. "I'm proposing that we handle our personal relationship like adults, with transparency and respect for professional boundaries. And I'm proposing that we stop letting my ex-wife's political ambitions dictate our choices." Zahara stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. "Ethan, this is your life's work. You can't just walk away from running the company because—" "I'm not walking away," he interrupted gently. "I'm choosing a different path, one that includes board meetings and strategic planning, but also dinner conversations and Saturday mornings, and the possibility of building something real with someone who sees me for who I actually am." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Zahara felt tears threatening, not of sadness but of something approaching awe. No one had ever reorganized their entire life for her. No one had ever seen her as worth that kind of sacrifice. "There's one more thing," Diane said, pulling out a final document. "Mrs. Sterling's investigator has agreed to provide testimony about her attempts to manufacture evidence. If she continues to harass either of you, we have grounds for a restraining order." Ethan moved closer to Zahara, close enough that she could see the vulnerability beneath his decisive exterior. "So what do you say? Are you willing to see where this goes if we remove all the obstacles?" Zahara looked at him, this powerful, successful man who was willing to redesign his professional life for the possibility of personal happiness. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the practical concerns and potential complications. Then she thought about Saturday morning at the diner, about reading poetry in the bookstore, about the way he made her feel like her dreams were worth pursuing. "I say yes," she whispered, "but only if you're sure this is what you want." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As he reached for her hand, Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I assume you'll want to make the transition official with legal documentation?" "Already prepared," Diane said, producing another set of papers. "The board will need to approve the CEO transition, but that's a formality at this point." As they left Harrison's office together, Zahara realized that Miranda's attempt to destroy their relationship had actually freed them from the very constraints she'd tried to exploit. Sometimes, Zahara thought, the greatest gift your enemies could give you was forcing you to choose what mattered most. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, she knew exactly what that was. True love isn't just about finding someone worth changing for. It's about finding someone who makes you brave enough to become who you really are. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening when most of Chicago was rushing toward weekend plans, Zahara found herself alone in the 42nd floor office, that had become the center of her world. The transition to working with Marcus Delacroix as CEO had been surprisingly smooth. He was brilliant, demanding in his own way, but without the complex emotional undercurrents that had defined her work with Ethan. She was finishing up quarterly reports when she heard the elevator chime. Ethan emerged, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the casual sweater and jeans that had become his weekend uniform. As chairman, he only came to the office 3 days a week now, spending the rest of his time on strategic planning and what he called remembering how to have a life. "Working late again?" he asked, setting one of the cups on her desk. "Marcus wants the Southeast expansion analysis ready for Monday's board meeting," Zahara replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Some things never change. Some things do, though." There was something in his voice that made her look up. He was leaning against her desk, studying her with an intensity that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Not the desperate urgency of their early attraction, but something deeper and more settled. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. "It means that 3 months ago, you would have stayed here until midnight perfecting a report that was already excellent. Tonight you were about to pack up and leave at a reasonable hour. How do you know I was about to leave?" "Because I know you," he smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "And because I was hoping you might want to have dinner with me." They'd been having dinner together regularly since the HR situation had been resolved, but something about tonight felt different, more significant. Zahara saved her work and gathered her belongings, hyper-aware of Ethan watching her every movement. "So where are we going?" she asked as they waited for the elevator. "My place," he said simply. "I want to cook for you." The admission surprised her. In all their dinners together, they'd always gone to restaurants, maintaining a subtle boundary between their public relationship and private intimacy. His penthouse apartment was territory they hadn't yet explored. Ethan's home occupied the top 2 floors of a building overlooking the lake, but it wasn't the cold, austere space Zahara had expected. Instead, she found warmth, exposed brick walls, comfortable furniture that looked lived in rather than designed, bookshelves that reached the ceiling and overflowed with everything from business journals to poetry collections. "This is beautiful," she said, moving toward the windows that offered a panoramic view of the city lights reflecting off Lake Michigan. "My grandfather's influence," Ethan said, hanging up their coats. "He always said a home should feel like a sanctuary, not a showroom." As he moved around the kitchen, preparing what turned out to be surprisingly skillful pasta with homemade sauce, Zahara explored the living spaces. She found family photos she'd never seen, Ethan as a young boy with his grandfather, college graduation pictures, shots from construction sites where a much younger Ethan worked alongside men in hard hats. "You actually worked construction," she called out. "Every summer through college," he replied from the kitchen. "Grandfather insisted. Said I needed to understand the business from the ground up, literally." She continued browsing, stopping when she found something that made her heart skip. On a side table near the couch was a copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God, the same book she'd read to him in the bookstore weeks ago. "Ethan," she said, carrying the book back to the kitchen. "Is this—" "I bought it the day after our bookstore visit," he admitted, not looking up from the stove. "I wanted to understand what moved you, what shaped the way you see the world. And I understood why you wanted to teach, why you wanted to help people fall in love with stories." He turned to face her. "There's something powerful about finding yourself reflected in someone else's words." Over dinner, which was delicious and proved that Ethan had hidden depths she was still discovering, they talked about books, about the changes at the company, about the small intimacies of daily life that had become precious to both of them. "Can I ask you something?" Zahara said as they moved to the couch with glasses of wine. "Anything. Do you ever regret it? Stepping back from the CEO role, restructuring everything for us?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "I regret waiting so long to do it. I regret the years I spent building walls instead of bridges. But choosing you, choosing us, that's the first decision I've made in years that feels like it came from who I really am, instead of who I thought I should be. Even when it's complicated, even when people talk. Especially then." He set down his wine and turned to face her fully. "Zahara, do you know what I was most afraid of when I met you?" She shook her head. "I was afraid that I'd forgotten how to feel anything real, that success had insulated me so completely that I'd lost the ability to connect with another person." He reached for her hand. "You proved me wrong. You reminded me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the only way to build something meaningful." "You did the same for me," Zahara said softly. I spent so many years trying to be what other people needed that I forgot what I actually wanted. You made me remember that my dreams matter too. Speaking of dreams, Ethan said, and she heard nervousness creep into his voice. I have something to show you. He disappeared into another room and returned with a manila folder. I've been working on this for the past 2 weeks. I wanted to surprise you. Zahara opened the folder and found documents that made her breath catch. Applications for graduate programs in creative writing. Letters of recommendation already completed. A business plan for a non-profit literacy organization. Ethan, what is this? It's a choice, he said quietly. The writing programs are at Northwestern and University of Chicago. You could keep working while you study if you want. The non-profit is something we could build together. Literacy programs for underserved communities, writing workshops for kids who need to believe their stories matter. Zahara stared at the papers, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness, the way he'd listened not just to what she'd said, but to what she'd dreamed. You did all this for me? I did it for us. I did it because I want to build a life with you that honors both of our dreams, not just our obligations. She looked up at him, this man who'd reorganized his entire world to make room for love, who'd seen potential in her that she'd been afraid to acknowledge herself. Ethan, she said, her voice trembling with emotion she could no longer contain. I love you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was the first time either of them had said it, though the feeling had been growing for weeks. I love you too, he replied, his voice rough with emotion, more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't tentative or questioning. It was a promise, a commitment, a recognition of something that had been building since the moment she'd spoken with a trembling voice in his conference room. As they held each other on the couch, overlooking the city that had brought them together, Zahara realized that love wasn't about finding someone who completed you. It was about finding someone who inspired you to become the fullest version of yourself. So, Ethan said, pulling back to look at her, what do you think? Are you ready to take on graduate school, save literacy, and put up with a reformed workaholic who's still figuring out how to balance spreadsheets with sonnets? Zahara laughed, the sound bright and free. I think I'm ready for anything, as long as we're doing it together. Outside the windows, Chicago sparkled in the darkness like a constellation of possibilities. And for the first time in her life, Zahara felt like she was exactly where she belonged, not because it was safe or practical or expected, but because it was real. Because sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who doesn't just hear your voice when it trembles. They help you discover the strength that was always underneath. In the end, the greatest courage isn't in avoiding fear, it's in choosing love despite it. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the community center in Bronzeville, casting golden light across the circle of teenagers, sitting cross-legged on colorful cushions. Zahara Williams Whitmore stood at the front of the room, holding a worn copy of The House on Mango Street, her voice clear and confident as she read Sandra Cisneros' words about finding your own voice in a world that often tried to silence it. Who can tell me what Esperanza means when she says her name sounds like the number 9 in English, but in Spanish it sounds like hope? Zahara asked, looking around the circle of young faces, some eager, some guarded, all carrying stories that deserved to be heard. A girl named Amara raised her hand tentatively. Maybe it means that how people see you depends on how they choose to understand you. That's beautiful, Amara. What do you think about that idea? That our identity can change based on who's looking at us? As the discussion unfolded, Zahara marveled at how natural this felt, how teaching these kids through the Stories That Matter literacy program had become the work that fed her soul. 3 afternoons a week, she left her position as Director of Strategic Communications at Whitmore Industries, a role that had evolved from administrative assistant to executive leadership, and came here to remember why words had always been her first love. Through the window, she could see Ethan setting up tables in the courtyard for the community lunch program they sponsored. He'd traded his expensive suits for jeans and work shirts on volunteer days, and watching him laugh with the elderly men who came for the free meals never failed to make her heart skip. Ms. Zahara, called Marcus, one of her regular students, are you going to read us some of your own writing today? The question still made her nervous, even after 2 years of sharing her work. The creative writing MFA from Northwestern, completed part-time while maintaining her career, had taught her technical skills and critical analysis. But it was these kids who'd taught her that vulnerability was the price of authentic storytelling. Actually, she said, reaching into her bag. "I brought something new. It's a story about a woman who thought she knew what she wanted until she discovered what she needed." As she began reading the opening pages of her first completed novel, a story about love, professional ambition, and finding the courage to rewrite your life, she noticed Ethan had paused in his work outside. He was listening through the open window, the same expression on his face that he'd worn in the bookstore 2 years ago when she'd first read aloud to him. After the session ended and the teenagers had dispersed with promises to work on their own stories, Zahara found Ethan cleaning up in the courtyard. "Good workshop?" he asked, pulling her into his arms, despite the fact that anyone could see them. Public displays of affection had taken some getting used to, but they'd learned that hiding love required more energy than celebrating it. "Marcus is writing a memoir about growing up in foster care," she said, resting her head against his chest. "Amara's working on a collection of poems about her grandmother's immigration story. These kids have so much to say." "Like their teacher," Ethan murmured into her hair. "Speaking of which, how did the novel reading go?" "Terrifying and wonderful. I think they actually listened." "Of course they listened. You have a gift for making people feel seen through your words." They walked home together through the streets of Chicago, past the coffee shop where they'd had their first real conversation, past the bookstore where she'd fallen in love with both literature and the man beside her. Their apartment, a compromise between his penthouse and her practical nature, was in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and enough bookshelves to house both of their collections. As they prepared dinner together, moving around each other with the practiced choreography of people who'd learned to share space and dreams, Zahara reflected on how much had changed since that nervous morning when she'd first walked into Whitmore Industries. "Margaret called today," Ethan said, chopping vegetables for their salad. "The Literacy Foundation Board approved funding for the summer writing camp." "All of it?" "All of it. 50 kids, 2 weeks, full scholarships. You're going to need to hire more teachers." Zahara felt tears threaten, not from sadness but from the overwhelming reality that the dreams she'd been afraid to voice were becoming tangible, lasting change in the world. "There's something else," Ethan said, and she heard something in his voice that made her look up from the pasta she was stirring. "I got a call from the publisher today about your novel." Her heart stopped. She'd submitted the manuscript 3 months ago, fully prepared for rejection but needing to try anyway. "And? They want to publish it, Zahara. They want to publish your book." The wooden spoon fell from her hands as she processed the words. Her novel, the story of a woman finding her voice, her strength, her place in the world, would be on shelves where other people could find themselves in its pages. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. They're offering a 2-book deal, and they think it could be their lead literary fiction title for next spring." Before she could respond, Ethan had swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and cried simultaneously. When he set her down, she saw tears in his eyes too. "I'm so proud of you," he said, cupping her face gently. "Not because you got published, but because you were brave enough to try, because you trusted your voice enough to share it with the world. I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said. "Without us." "You could have," Ethan replied firmly, "but I'm grateful you didn't have to." Later that evening, as they sat on their couch reading, Zahara working on edits for her second novel, Ethan reviewing proposals for new community initiatives, she looked around at the life they'd built together. Photos from their small wedding the previous spring, mixed with pictures from literacy events and family gatherings. Books everywhere, evidence of dreams pursued and stories told, a home that felt like the sanctuary Ethan's grandfather had described. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked. "When I walked into your office with shaking hands and a trembling voice?" Ethan looked up from his reading, marking his place with his finger. "Every day. Do you know what I think about most?" "What?" "How you were brave enough to be nervous. Most people who came into that office were either terrified or trying to impress me. You were just authentically yourself, even when it was uncomfortable. I was terrified too, but you didn't hide it behind false confidence. You let me see your vulnerability, and somehow that made me want to be vulnerable too." Zahara closed her laptop and moved closer to him on the couch. "What do you think would have happened if Miranda hadn't tried to destroy us?" "We probably would have taken longer to figure it out," Ethan said, pulling her against his side. "Fear might have kept us circling each other for months instead of weeks. In a strange way, she forced us to be honest about what we wanted." "Do you ever hear from her?" "Christmas cards," Ethan said with a rueful smile. "She and the senator seem happy. Turns out all she really wanted was someone who shared her political ambitions. She got her perfect life and I got mine. As they settled into comfortable silence, Zahara thought about the teenagers she'd worked with that afternoon, about the stories they were brave enough to tell, about the dreams they were just beginning to articulate. She thought about her novel, about readers who might find hope in pages she'd written from her own experience of transformation. Most of all, she thought about the man beside her, who'd seen past her careful professionalism to the writer and dreamer underneath, who'd reorganized his entire world to make room for love, who'd taught her that the greatest courage was in allowing yourself to be fully known. Outside their windows, Chicago hummed with the energy of millions of people pursuing their own versions of happiness. But inside their home, in the warm circle of lamplight and shared dreams, Zahara felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived authentically. She still returned to the same places, the office building, the coffee shops, the streets that had witnessed her transformation, but now she walked through them with steady steps and a quiet smile, no longer searching for who she might become. Because sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you discover that becoming yourself isn't about changing everything. It's about finding the courage to honor what was always true, and the wisdom to share that truth with someone who sees it as beautiful. And sometimes, just sometimes, that person loves you back with the same fierce tenderness that makes ordinary moments feel like poetry, and everyday conversations sound like the most important words ever spoken. Would you have the courage to rewrite your entire life for love? What dreams are you still too afraid to speak out loud? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.